Okay, let's jump right in. Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're unpacking one of the most chaotic, truly transformative periods in global history, the Spanish-American Wars of Independence. Spanning roughly from 1808 to 1833, this wasn't just a single, isolated revolution. We are talking about a massive, multi-decade continental conflict. Over the next few minutes, we're going to trace exactly how a political crisis inside Europe sparked a domino effect that completely shattered a global empire and fundamentally redrew the map of the Americas. To understand how this massive global empire fell apart, you really have to start with a fascinating question. How does one single guy inadvertently cause the collapse of the Spanish Empire and trigger massive independence movements thousands of miles away? Well, when that guy is Napoleon Bonaparte, things get messy fast. In a classic case of unintended consequences, his attempt to conquer Europe accidentally created this huge power vacuum. It tore a global empire in half and, literally, changed the world forever. Here is how we're breaking it all down today. First up, Napoleon's spark in Spain. Then we'll dive into exactly why open war broke out, followed by the epic clash between realists and revolutionaries. After that, we'll look at the grim consequences of the conflict. And finally, the emergence of brand new nations. All right, part one, the spark, Napoleon and Spain. Let's look at 1808, because a complex and frankly chaotic series of diplomatic maneuvers inside Europe completely lit the fuse for everything that followed. It is wild how incredibly fast things fall apart here. In March, you have the Mutiny of Aranjuez, which forces King Charles IV of Spain to abdicate in favor of his son, Ferdinand VII. But Napoleon sees an opening. By May, he lures both Charles and Ferdinand into France and forces them into what are known as the abdications of Bayonne. And then, just a month later, in June, Napoleon just goes ahead and names his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, as the new king of Spain. So in basically 3 months, the legitimate Spanish monarchy is just gone. To truly grasp the magnitude of this, we have to understand what these abdications of Bayonne actually meant on the ground. This wasn't just a simple change of management. By forcing the Spanish kings to hand their dynastic rights over to the Bonaparte family, Napoleon effectively destroyed the old regime of the Spanish Empire. Because the colonies in the Americas belonged legally to the crown, the sudden capture of the legitimate king created a massive, immediate power vacuum across both hemispheres. Now, what's really interesting about this is how the people reacted. The Spanish and American populations utterly rejected the French king. No way were they accepting Joseph Bonaparte. Instead, they formed local juntas, basically governing committees across Spain and the Americas. And here's the irony. Their initial goal was actually to govern in the name of the captive king, Ferdinand VII, to protect his rights. But by setting up their own local governments to defend the crown, they accidentally planted the very seeds for total self-rule and ultimately independence. Which brings us to part two. Why did the wars actually break out? At its core, it boils down to a massive ideological collision. On one side, you had the centralist view, held by the Spanish government and the Cortes of Cadiz. They wanted a unified monarchy where the European peninsula maintained hegemony and control. Standard empire stuff. But on the other side, you had the pluralist view, championed by those American juntas. They argued that the Americas were autonomous kingdoms belonging to the crown, not just mere colonies to be exploited, and therefore they demanded self-governance and autonomy. It was an irreconcilable difference in how the empire should even operate. And this ideological split was fueled by very tangible grievances. The American creoles, the people of Spanish descent born in the Americas, wanted political power. They wanted the ability to trade freely, and they deeply resented the strict commercial monopolies imposed by Spain. To make matters worse, the Spanish Cortes and Cadiz flat out refused to grant the Americans equal representation in Parliament. But the ultimate breaking point, that came when King Ferdinand VII finally returned to the throne in 1814. Instead of embracing reform or rewarding loyalty, he completely rejected the liberal 1812 Constitution and brutally restored absolute tyranny. For the Americans, the path forward was suddenly crystal clear. It had to be full independence.
Moving into part three, realists versus revolutionaries.
So the crucial point is that this was a clash of absolute titans representing two entirely different visions for the continent's future. On the realist side, you had highly capable military leaders and viceroys, guys like Felix Maria Calla in Mexico, Pablo Murillo in New Granada, and José Fernando de Abascal in Peru. They staunchly defended the unity of the empire and the rights of the crown. Opposing them, of course, were the famed independentist revolutionaries, the Libertadores. We're talking Simón Bolívar in the north, José de San Martín in the south, and Miguel Hidalgo in Mexico. Now, check out this number. Back in 1808, Spain had a massive military presence. Actually, to be precise, 125,700 troops stationed all across the Americas, stretching from Mexico all the way down to the Rio de la Plata. But here is the most vital piece of context. The vast majority of these troops defending the Spanish crown were actually native-born Americans. Because of that, these conflicts were deeply, deeply internal. These are often considered civil wars just as much as wars of independence. For years, long before significant reinforcements ever arrived from Europe, local Americans were fighting local Americans. It was a profound ideological schism, tearing communities and sometimes even families totally apart. It wasn't simply a united America fighting off a foreign Spanish invader. It was a fractured society fighting over its own destiny.
This leads us to part 4, the consequences, mortality and exile.
The human cost of this struggle was absolutely staggering. It's estimated that roughly 1 million people lost their lives in total across the continent. When you consider that the entire population of the region was less than 20 million at the time, the sheer scale of this demographic disaster becomes horrifyingly clear. And when you break it down by region, the war of attrition is just brutal. New Spain, modern-day Mexico, suffered an estimated 600,000 deaths. New Granada in Venezuela saw roughly 400,000 dead. In places like Venezuela, the population was severely decimated, literally losing a massive percentage of its total inhabitants over 15 years of relentless, grinding conflict. And this brilliantly illustrates how the devastation went way beyond just battlefield casualties. Both sides practiced policies of terror. The war dragged on for decades, resulting in the prolonged destruction of major cities and agricultural fields. This led to a complete paralysis of trade, a total loss of capital, and widespread famine. On top of that, the conflict resulted in the forced exile and eventually the legal expulsion of massive numbers of Spanish civilians, which permanently altered the social fabric of the entire continent. Finally, Part 5, the emergence of new nations. So the revolutionaries eventually achieved their ultimate goals, right? They secured independence and ended the Spanish commercial monopoly, opening up free trade. But victory came at a severe cost to continental stability. Those massive unified viceroyalties fragmented into multiple, often highly unstable new countries. Stripped of a strong unified military and totally exhausted by years of civil war, these new nations faced increased vulnerability to foreign interventions. This is a crucial takeaway for us. Independence was won, but the foundation of these new nations was incredibly fragile, a tragic reality that would very soon be seen in the U.S. intervention in Mexico. It's also wild to think about just how long it took for this new reality to be officially recognized by Spain. It wasn't until 1836, following the death of the ever-stubborn King Ferdinand VII, that the Spanish Cortes finally gave up. They officially renounced their claims to their former possessions and began authorizing treaties of peace and recognition. The era of reconquest attempts was, at long last, officially over. Let's move to Colombia and see how this builds into the geopolitical map we know today. Back in 1826, Simón Bolívar convened the Congress of Panama with a truly grand vision to create a united federation of South American states. But it failed. The regional differences, the sheer massive size of the continent, and the lingering bitter divisions from those civil wars meant that his dream of a unified continent splintered into the modern individual borders of Latin America that we recognize today. Which leaves us with a truly fascinating historical what if. How would the world map, and honestly the entire global balance of power, look today if Bolivar's dream of a united South America had actually survived the trauma of those wars? The Spanish-American Wars of Independence birthed the modern Americas, for sure, but the scars of how those nations were formed, through crisis, civil war, and fragmentation, continue to shape the continent's story right up to today. Thanks for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, and we'll see you next time.